So welcome, friends. I'm Father John Deere, and welcome to this Beatitude Zoom session with our very special guest today, my friend Robert Ellsberg, coming to us live from New York. Again, let me ask you all to mute yourselves and to stay muted. And if you have, please write your questions and comments in the chat link there for Robert later. Robert, I hope, will speak about 45 minutes or so. And then we're going to open it up for questions and comments and discussion for the remaining 45 minutes. My friend Martha Hennessy, Robert's friend too, Dorothy Day's granddaughter, is also on the Zoom, and I hope she'll give a little response to Robert when we get there. In a few days, I will send out the Zoom recording link if you want to listen again. So let's begin with a little prayer. I just invite you to take a deep breath maybe and have a moment of silence and give thanks for this great moment to be with Robert Ellsberg and reflect on the great Dorothy Day. And so I invite you to enter into the presence of the God of peace who loves you infinitely, unconditionally, and wildly. And let's welcome the nonviolent Jesus into our hearts and our circle. And take a moment to ask for all the graces of peace and love and nonviolence for ourselves and our poor world. God of peace, thank you for all the mighty blessings of peace and love and life that you give each one of us. Be with us now and bless us as we reflect with our friend Robert Ellsberg on the life and writings of Dorothy Day, your servant. And also as we reflect on your call to us to follow the nonviolent Jesus like Dorothy on the path of peace and service and universal love. Bless us that we might practice and spread your gospel teachings of love and nonviolence, that we too might be your holy people of universal love, your beatitude people, your beloved sons and daughters, holy peacemakers, in Jesus' name, amen. So welcome again, dear friends. I'm really been looking forward to this, and I know many of you had too. I really give thanks to the God of peace for Dorothy Day. I don't know about you, but she's been part of my whole life. And I remember when she died, the Washington Post said, literally 2 days later, if the world survived, this will be known as the age of Dorothy Day, just as we think of the Middle Ages as the time of St. Francis. We don't know anything else about the Middle Ages but St. Francis. To me, Dorothy Day is like the North Star or the Grand Canyon. She's just this massive witness to the gospel. And I agree with Pope Francis that she's equal to Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King. And I'm in awe, not just because of the Catholic worker and her hospitality to homeless, but because from day one, especially in the 1930s and the 1940s, she was totally against war. There wasn't one priest or bishop in the United States, as far as we could tell, who was against war totally. There was one who was sort of John Forward, but he was really an advocate for the just war theory. Everyone was for war. The U.S. Catholic Bishops' Conference was founded for the sole purpose of supporting war. And the troops, go and research. It's shocking. And it's hard to really get to appreciate what she did. And so she was so brave and she was so faithful. And none of us would be here without her. So as we reflect on her today, I always think, reflecting on the saints and with the guide of Robert Ellsberg, we're in retreat mode. And so I invite us, that means that we're really reflecting on our own lives and how we too can deepen in gospel nonviolence and service to the poor and gospel peacemaking in this terrible moment that the world is going through, that we might be bright, faithful witnesses to the nonviolent Jesus like Dorothy. So I'm really happy to welcome my friend Robert Ellsberg and introduce him to all of you if you don't know him. Like Dorothy Day, Robert is a treasure to the church. And I thank the God of peace for Robert. I think he's one of the most influential people in the North American church over the last 4 decades. Robert is editor and publisher of Orbis Books, Last year, for those of you who were part of the Beatitudes Center, he led a memorable Zoom session with us on the Beatitudes and the Saints based on his best-selling book, All Saints, which I hope you can see here. I'm holding it up. When he was a kid, Robert Xeroxed the Pentagon Papers for his father. And then in the 1970s, joined the New York Catholic Worker, and Dorothy Day met him and immediately got him and asked young Robert to edit the Catholic Worker. And since then, Robert has edited so many of her books. I'm going to hold up some Dorothy Day selected writings. I have all of them, All the Way to Heaven, the selected letters of Dorothy Day, and one that's kind of my favorite and for many, The Duty of Delight, the Diaries of Dorothy Day. Just amazing works and accomplishments. So this year, Robert has published 2 new books on her famous On Pilgrimage columns, Dorothy Day on Pilgrimage the 60s and Dorothy Day on Pilgrimage the 70s, which I hope you can see here. Just an amazing accomplishment, Robert. And I encourage everybody to get them from Orbis Books. And so I've invited Robert to speak about these new books of her writings from the last 20 years of her life, and to share anything else he would like to share with us about his teacher and mentor and our Saint Dorothy Day. So everybody, please join me in giving a rousing welcome and a sign of applause to my friend, the great Robert Ellsberg. Robert, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, John. It's really a pleasure to be with you. And I was amazed when you told me how many people had signed up for this program. I know that there are people here who also knew Dorothy Day well, and probably of an age to remember the decades that I'm going to be talking about today, the 60s and the 70s. This is the first time I've talked about these 2 new books that I've edited. As John mentioned, this represents now 5 volumes of Dorothy Day's writings that I've edited. And as he mentioned, it was in 1975. I was 19 when I first went to the Catholic Worker, and I really hadn't been planning to stay there very long. But when he says that she got me quickly, there's some truth to that, because I'd only been there a matter of just a few months, literally, when she asked me to be the managing editor of the Catholic Worker newspaper. I was 20 at the time. I obviously didn't have any evident qualifications for a job like that, but it's not the last time in my life that I this kind of skyhook of grace has swooped down and put me where I needed to be. There at the time, I don't think there was really anybody else who wanted or was interested in that kind of work, or that aspect of the worker, as much as I was. And I'd written some articles about Gandhi that she really liked. So she asked me to be managing editor of the paper. And I obviously couldn't have known at that time that she was pointing me in the direction of, or setting me on this path of my life's work and vocation. Not just the fact that I am have been working now for 35 years as publisher of the Catholic, of Orbis Books, but literally becoming her editor after she died in 1980. John shared with you covers of some of those books. I edited her selected writings that came out 40 years ago. And then 25 years after her death, I was asked by Marquette University Press to edit her diaries and her letters. And it was interesting, in each of these projects, I felt that I came to know something deeper about her. I mean, when I did I'd known her, I'd read The Long Loneliness, but when I first did that anthology of all her writings, all her published writings, and put that together, reading through everything she'd written in the Catholic Worker, which was like about 1,000 articles or something in her lifetime, and all of her books, to really get a sense of the broad scope of her writing about politics, about labor, about her own life, about spirituality. as well as I thought I knew her from that, when I edited her diaries, I felt that it was an utter revelation to me, because I had, like a lot of people, known Dorothy, the public person, what she shared with the world, but not so much, to see how that was rooted in a kind of dailiness in her spirituality and her witness. It's a highly unusual book. I don't know anything like that really in the annals of the saints, and I've read a lot about saints. To see a holy person accompany them, on this pilgrimage through their daily life, and that means their encounters with other people, things that are in the news, things that are happening in the community, her own examination of conscience, what she's reading, what she's praying about, the faults that she sees in herself, and her desire to be better, to try better, and it was something that I had never really considered before, because we think of a lot of great saints in terms of these dramatic moments, St. Francis kissing a leper or something like that, Dorothy Day going to jail, or even starting the Catholic Worker and working, in a soup kitchen. And it makes you realize that for the great saints, as much as for any of us, most of our life is just spent in ordinary daily life. And what came across to me very much through this was that Dorothy's spirituality was forged in this crucible of not just going to Mass every day, which she did, and not the sacraments, and not getting up early every morning to read scripture, and not going on pilgrimages, and not saying the rosary. She did all those things. And we can say, well, that was her spiritual life. But you really have this sense that her spiritual life was this daily kind of reflection and digest of her encounters with other people and the things that happened to her. All of that lived out in the presence of God. And to me, I think, and for a lot of people who read that, it was a kind of paradigm shift in really understanding the holiness of this woman. I went on from that to edit her letters all the way to heaven. And that too was a revelation, because there, instead of seeing her reflecting, on her own, interior kind of dialogue with God, you see a spirituality in relationship with other people. You see her listening and expressing herself, and on a journey with other people who mattered to her, or who raised questions or criticized her, or that she admired, or who were members of the family, or members of the Catholic Worker, or all kinds of people, famous people like Thomas Merton, other people that no one's ever heard of. And you see the kind of the Dorothy Day that she shared in a very intimate way with the people in her lives. And as I said, even though I knew Dorothy, I wouldn't exaggerate to say that was better, that we were very close compared to lots of other people. Here to see these relationships over time with people like Daniel Berrigan, or Catherine de Hewitt Doherty, or Ammon Hennessy. The way that she expressed herself, and when she was kind of sharing with somebody that she really loved and trusted. So those were, I think, milestones in my understanding of Dorothy Day. So now I focused on just 2 decades, editing her Catholic Worker articles from the 60s and the 70s. On Pilgrimage, the 60s; On Pilgrimage, the 70s, which came out this year. And here again, even though I guess this is going back to the public Dorothy, to read these articles, in sequence, and edited down, abridged, of course, because some of her articles would just go on forever and ever, describing everywhere she went, and what the bus was like, and the people she met along the way, and all this kind of thing. I tried to boil it down to what I thought was really worth reading and worth remembering. What you see her there doing is you see this incredible prophet of our time, living out her witness and her spirituality in response to the signs of the times. And those are particularly significant decades. The 60s, because it was such an epic of change. The 70s, because that's also her last decade, and you see her not just responding to the outside world, but dealing with her own internal kind of winding down and letting go, and moving to the end of her pilgrimage. So there's a very significant decades. One of them happens to be coincide with the years that I knew her, but those were the last 5 years of her life when she really was in a, I won't say retirement, but as what she called the third stage of life, a kind of letting go and focusing on eternity. But a lot still happened in that decade. The 60s are, is quite an extraordinary decade, as for reasons that we all know, because it was this time of just enormous change socially, politically. It was a great time of change in the church. That's the decade of Vatican II. It was a change in the culture in all kinds of ways, the counterculture, cultural revolution, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, all of that's going on. And to see Dorothy now in her 60s herself, coinciding with that decade and responding in a way that shows how incredibly engaged she was with her world and her times. When I, a lot of those changes were being fueled by this young generation of the baby boom, and of course there was this, expression, don't trust anybody over the age of 30. And here's Dorothy Day in her 60s at that time, who was unusually adept and equipped to be able to engage with what was happening with young people and the questions that they were struggling with, because she identified with those a lot. Because in her youth, when she was that age, she was living through this time of revolution and art, cultural and political upheaval. When she dropped out of college, as you know, and moved to New York City and worked on a couple of radical newspapers. And so she was surrounded by socialists and anarchists and labor activists and kind of people who then became founders of the American Communist Party. So people who are raising all kinds of questions about bourgeois society, about capitalism, about the American system and inequality. She was living around immigrants, literally right off the boat, and identifying with their experience and their struggles that were in such contrast to this kind of myth of American, exceptionalism and everything. She really had this experience of the American life from below, from the underside, of those who suffered injustice. She was involved in anti-war protests. She knew people who were going to jail or going into exile to avoid the draft during World War I. She was around kind of poets and playwrights like Eugene O'Neill. She was living a somewhat wild kind of life. She had, talk about the sexual revolution. She had an affair with a man, got pregnant, had an abortion. This is all, beginning of the last century. And it gave her, I think, a perspective of great compassion and understanding of the young generation, the youth culture of the 60s, of young people who were going through a lot of this, their own kind of turmoil and soul searching as they were questioning all the myths that they'd been raised on in the 50s about, greatness of America and trusting authority and trusting the government. And the decade just began, with the Bay of Pigs invasion and the assassination of John F. Kennedy and the civil rights, struggle in the South, and the pictures of dogs, being sicked on African-American demonstrators. And all of this is going on. The revolution that was happening around the world in Latin America, the Vietnam War, all these things. Now, she had another experience, you could say, of era of protest and revolt. After she had that early, life, experience in the radical movement, she then becomes a Catholic. After, having a child with this man she was in love with, and deciding to become a Catholic and separating from him and going through this kind of lonely time of figuring out what she's supposed to do. But the important thing was she didn't leave her radical past behind her. She didn't leave her commitment to the poor and the oppressed and the immigrants and the cause of social injustice. She didn't leave that behind her. She took that with her, but she just didn't know where to put it. There was nowhere in the Catholic Church at that time where there was a space for those kinds of questions. She had to invent it herself. And that happened when she met Peter Morin. And so now we jump ahead to this other great crisis in American history, the Depression. It's 1932 when she meets Peter Morin. She starts the Catholic Worker on May 1st in 1933, right in the heart of the Depression. Now the questions are coming from unemployment and hunger and homelessness, labor struggles, and in a lot of those arenas, it was our old communist friends who were kind of leading the charge, and Catholics were on the sidelines or uninterested, or didn't know how to relate to that, or afraid of it because they thought that's what communists do. And so she meets Peter Morin, and he inspires her with this idea of how to put together, her faith, her Catholic faith, and the gospel and the Beatitudes, with this commitment to building a new society in the shell of the old. And there were kind of three aspects to that were essential to the Catholic worker. One was the spiritual insight that comes, from the Gospels, that what we do to the poor, we do directly to Jesus. I was hungry and you fed me. I was naked and you clothed me. And that became the foundation of these houses of hospitality and the works of mercy, feeding the hungry. Now, if Dorothy Day had only done that, that would have been a great thing, and she would be probably still, maybe she would have become a saint already. But that would have been very consistent with, traditional forms of charity and responding to the needs of the poor that religious orders have done. What would have been unusual is that she did it as a layperson. But she combined that then with this social critique that she'd brought over with her from her past to raise questions about why people were hungry, why there was so much inequality and injustice, and challenging that kind of system, this capitalist system. Now, that's taken it in a whole different, kind of direction. But that was an essential ingredient of what made the Catholic worker so radical and so seeming to kind of pose as maybe a Catholic alternative to the communist-led social movements. Here were Catholics who were addressing the working people and the unemployed people and saying the gospel has a radical message for you. And there are men and women of God who are on your side and care about you, are in the struggle with you. Now, that would have been great too, but then there was this third kind of ingredient that I think came from Peter Morin, because Dorothy was all into protests and strikes and things like that from her radical past. But Peter Morin brought in a third ingredient, which was this idea that it's not just enough to protest. You have to have a vision of an alternative. You have to have this picture of an alternative society, alternative values, and you have to live those out. You don't just talk about them or write about them in the paper. You live in the present by those values you would like to see in this alternative society that, instead of being governed by greed and competition and materialism, would be governed by solidarity and community and self-sacrifice and voluntary poverty and integration of the material and the spiritual realms. So all those three kinds of things are all in there. One of those aspects of this alternative also had this prophetic ecological aspect, because Peter Morin had this idea that we had to show this concern for the earth, farming communes, get back to a kind of direct relationship to the earth and to the land. So that was all part of this kind of vision that might have seemed sort of utopian or obscure or eccentric for a lot of the decades. But now, not that we're all going to live on a farm, but that kind of concern for the earth that we live on as being just as important. The link that Pope Francis makes between care for the poor or option for the poor and option for the earth, care for creation. That was, again, something that was built into the DNA of the Catholic worker in a way that the church literally only in the last decade or so has begun to catch up with. So that's another aspect of that. Now, so the Catholic worker gets going in the 30s. In the 40s, then really comes to the fore, as John mentioned, Dorothy Day's commitment to nonviolence. And it was there before, but people could sort of overlook it. With World War II, you really couldn't overlook that. And that put the Catholic worker so far outside of any acceptable sort of mainstream in the church or elsewhere, that the worker kind of went into this sort of desert, phase. And then you have the 50s. Excuse me, this thing I didn't mean to. See me all right? The 50s then, with this kind of new post-war prosperity and this big economic boom and the middle class growing and Catholics becoming more integrated into kind of upwardly mobile middle class, life. And Dorothy Day's kind of countercultural in this sense, emphasis on being poor, of not buying into that success story, of staying close to the poor, of also not buying into the patriotism, the super patriotism of that time, and the anti-communism witch hunts and the McCarthyism and all that kind of stuff. The Cold War, all that's gearing up with the nuclear testing and building H-bombs and preparing for doomsday. And Dorothy Day, and some of her colleagues and fellow travelers are getting arrested for protesting civil defense drills in New York City, for instance. All that very consistent with with what she'd stood for all along, but wildly out of touch with where American culture was and where the Catholic Church in America was at that time, when Catholics were falling all over themselves to show how they were in the vanguard of Americanism and anti-communism. So this is, again, the worker seems to be is Catholic. Dorothy Day's doing what she's already been doing, but not really, vitally, seemingly engaged with where the country is. So that's why this decade of the 60s then becomes so interesting, because it's this time then, especially with the youth culture, the youth generation, young generation, raising very critical questions about America, American power, American war making, American injustice, and exporting injustice around the world, and those kind of contradictions, and also raising kind of the culture was raising questions about values. Is the most important thing just to be upwardly mobile and successful, or are there other kinds of values that are more important? All this stuff is sort of going on and brewing there, and Dorothy is kind of amazingly poised to kind of catch that wave. It's not that she changed. It's like that the culture was in this moment that was ready to acknowledge her or listen to her, and she becomes this kind of patron or godmother of a growing Catholic peace movement. And as John has said, there are people like Thomas Merton, who's famous writer of spirituality books, who gravitates to the Catholic worker to write these prophetic articles about nuclear war and Vietnam and race issues and stuff. You have people like Daniel Berrigan and Phil Berrigan being completely radicalized by the Catholic worker. You have people like Tom Cornell and Jim Forrest, who are alumni of the Catholic worker, who found the Catholic Peace Fellowship in the mid-60s. You really have the invention, as John's kind of saying, of this new idea that peacemaking and nonviolence are an essential or a critical expression of what it means to be a Christian. Now, Dorothy Day had been saying this for all these years, and it was just the culture and what was happening, the drama of what was happening in Vietnam in particular, the drama of what was happening with the Black freedom struggle in the South. These were occasions that made it possible. People began going to civil disobedience. You have Martin Luther King becoming the great prophet of nonviolence, in our time, and Catholics, nuns and priests going down to march with him in Selma. So there's this moment that's happening here. Now, you look at this book, The 60s, and it's almost this chronicle of the times, of the decades. It's a not just a great insight into Dorothy Day, but through what she was doing, you see her fingers and her footsteps, all over the kind of critical events of that time. I mean, I'll just mention a few of them. Of course, there's the Cuban Revolution, first of all, which, 1958, 59, and the Fidel Castro, and then emerged more as a Marxist and communist, had led this successful revolution in Cuba. And the church is freaking out about the whole thing. And in 1962, Dorothy goes to Cuba to see for herself and to be able to report back on the situation in the country. And what's amazing to a lot of people, and kind of shocking, and it's still almost shocking when you go back and read her articles about the Cuban Revolution, because Dorothy, you could say from her past, she always had a kind of romantic view of revolutionaries. She was really drawn to the example of, a few men and women who risked everything, risked their lives to take on, the powers, and just through their, and were successful. And it was strange for a lot of her readers and followers to say, well, Dorothy, you're a pacifist. How come you're being so kind of positive about this? And she says that she had more respect for people who took on injustice and tried to change the world, even if that meant through violence, than those who did nothing and were apathetic, stood on the sidelines, which included, as she felt, a lot of the church. Dorothy was, in a way, it's amazing to go back and read this, because this is long before liberation theology kind of arose. But she was always, from her past in the 50s too and everything, seeking kind of concordances. How can we find a meeting ground with people who share our commitment to social justice, even if we don't agree on everything about the means or how to do that? Now, you could go back in light of, the last 50 years and ask whether she was being naive. But when she went there, she saw, incredible, improvements that have been made in healthcare, in working conditions, in equality, in education, in medical care, and all these kinds of things. And she said, Catholics had their chance to do all of this. And then Castro, and the communists or Marxists, they come along, they're doing it. She quoted this, this gospel text where Jesus talks about, Father has two sons. He asks them to do something, and one of them says he'll do it, but then he doesn't do it. And then the other one says he's not going to do it, but then he does it. Which one did the will of the Father? She felt that this was an opportunity for Christians to outdo the Marxists in showing their dedication to the common good and self-sacrifice and a kind of heroic commitment to lay down their lives for their brothers and sisters. And she felt that a lot of the outrage about the revolution was really about property, and people would say, well, what about their violence and everything? She'd say, what about the hypocrisy of challenging people who are using violence, for the sake of social justice, while you've built this massive, institution preparing to destroy the world? And all that she was, long before this, it was kind of, common language. She talked about, really shouldn't use this word, but basically systemic violence, that there's violence in a system that condemns young children to die before their time because of hunger or preventable disease. It's the kind of thing that Dr. Paul Farmer, John's friend, has written, so much about this idea that healthcare should only be for the wealthy. It's wasted on poor people. Or they should say, well, what about their atheists? And she would say, well, what about the atheism of those who deny Christ and the poor every day? Our whole system is built on a kind of materialism and atheism. Even if we go to church every week, even if we read the Bible, even if we call ourselves Christians, effectively we are, just from that basic, teaching of Matthew 25. When were you hungry and we didn't feed you? Insofar as you didn't feed the least of my brothers and sisters, you did not feed me. So these are the kind of questions that she is raising, and she's calling on this kind of heroism of Christians to stay there and take risks and be part of this process. And if they do that, they're in a position to raise criticisms and challenges, and maybe even will suffer because of it. But that was basically the message she made. Now, it blows your mind to think of this Catholic woman in 1962, when we had just, within weeks of her being there, the United States and the Soviet Union almost blew up the world over Cuba, because we were so threatened, basically, by the idea of this revolution 90 miles from our shores. She was really, it was a kind of prophetic pointing toward the drama of what was going to happen in Latin America. She felt that revolution in Latin America, if it was violent, if it was led by Marxists, it was because Christians had defaulted on their responsibility to promote social justice. They've done it not just for decades, but for centuries. And she was really calling for a new kind of theology, a new kind of spirituality, not of violence, not of revolution, but of engagement in commitment to the poor, option for the poor, and social justice. If the church did that, there wouldn't be, it wouldn't give rise to these violent revolutions or whatever. So that was one of the things, in the 60s. There's then, of course, Vietnam. Now, because of her commitment to nonviolence, Dorothy was and the Catholic work were in the forefront of responding immediately to what was happening in Vietnam, which other people were still seeing, after Korean War and everything, as part of this Cold War drama of, confronting communism, promoting democracy, etc. She saw it as from the beginning as a racist war, as a neo-colonial war that was driven by power and business interests, and disregarding the cost in lives and the will of the people. She saw this from so early on. The Catholic worker organized the first protest against the Vietnam War in 1963. And later on, of course, this all exploded. But the Catholic worker continued to be a kind of feeding ground for a certain kind of radicalism. The very first person who was arrested for burning a draft card, David Miller, after it became illegal, was from the Catholic worker. Later, Tom Cornell from the Catholic worker and others, 1965, also burned their draft files, and she publicly supported them, even though that was a crime in itself to support that kind of civil disobedience against the draft laws. She was there through the whole drama of the Vietnam War, calling attention not just to the incredible violence that was being done, the napalm, these atrocities, aerial bombing, search and destroy, free fire zones, torture, all this happening, the incredible waste of money. All of the war, she always pointed out, is the opposite of the works of mercy. We're supposed to feed the hungry. War destroys food, makes people hungry. We're supposed to, shelter the homeless. We destroy shelters, etc. Leave people homeless and refugees. She, at the same time, it's important to point out that Dorothy, for her, peacemaking was not just about being against war. It was about a consistent kind of set of values and concern rooted in love for our neighbors, love for our enemies, and this consistency, kind of in a Gandhian sense, between means and ends. She was worried that that people would burn out very quickly, if they just felt that if we just get the biggest demonstration ever, it's going to end the war. She from her own experience, peacemaking was a long distance race. And she was afraid people would become desperate, they would become bitter, they would become conspiratorial, they would begin to adopt kind of methods of people that they opposed. And she was very worried that there was underlying kind of rage and violence simmering there within this anti-war movement that was not really rooted in a spirituality of peacemaking. So Dorothy, although you could say she was very rooted in this spirit of protest and disobedience, there was also a countercultural aspect in her relationship to the left and to these protest movements, in the sense that she always felt that they had to be grounded in a deeper sense of spirituality. Now, one of the other big things that's happening in the 60s is Vatican II. So it's an era of change in the church. And Dorothy engaged with that as well. And you see her, she actually went to Rome twice, 1963, to give support to Pope John the 23rd, who had just issued this wonderful encyclical Pacem in Terris, first great modern peace encyclical of our time. And she then, from that point, her emphasis was on trying to encourage the church to really address head on the sin of weapons of mass destruction, preparing for nuclear war. So in 1965, she goes to Rome and with in a group of a bunch of women there from an international group, fast for 10 days while the council is in session, debating about this final document they issued, the Church in the Modern World, praying that the church would issue a strong condemnation of nuclear war, which it did. Now, no, just because of Dorothy, but you could say, you know, this is building on what Dorothy had been kind of feeding into the lifeblood of the church for a long, long time. That here, finally in the mid 60s, the church issued this, you know, says that use of weapons of, you know, mass destruction against cities is a crime against God and humanity and is to be condemned unreservedly. You know? It's like the only condemnation that came out of Vatican II. She comes back from this trip, and here was a kind of an example of very difficult things, of where this kind of, you know, peace sentiment, you know, might be going in ways that she thought were frightening and dangerous. A member of the Catholic worker named Roger Laporte, a young man, without telling anybody he was going to do this, went to the United Nations, poured gasoline on himself and set himself on fire as a protest against the war, in the spirit of, you know, the Vietnamese Buddhists and Quakers and some other people who had done this in the Pentagon and elsewhere. It was a shocking thing that, and a lot of people freaked out. Thomas Merton freaked out and said he thought that peace movement was going crazy and wanted his name taken off of the list of sponsors of the Catholic Peace Fellowship. One of the articles in this book that I find particularly moving is the reflection that she wrote on Roger Laporte, where she talks about people are calling this a suicide, and of course suicide is supposedly, you know, is a mortal sin. On the other hand, moral theology kind of teaches that people who commit suicide are in such a desperate state of mind that they're not really entirely responsible for what they do, and we should pray for them and that sort of thing. But she says, you know, I really don't see this as a suicide. I see what Roger was doing was offering himself as a victim soul. His intention was not just to kill himself. His intention was to send such a powerful message of peace and concern for the people whose lives were, you know, were people being burned by napalm. And not only that, but of the whole mentality of our overheated capitalist economy that is kind of all excited about this, you know, possibilities for profits and all this kind of stuff. And here Roger Laporte, in his voluntary poverty and working at the Catholic Worker, was saying he didn't want to be a part of that, and he wanted his life to have a different message. And she said, that's those of us who knew him, those of the Catholic Worker, that's how we see him. You know, that it was, we see his intention was for peace. His intention was not just to die. You know, his intention was to save other lives. And it was, of course, not something that she would have wanted, you know, to be replicated or to encourage that other people should do this. It was a one-off kind of thing. But that way that she could respond to young people and people who cared so much about peace with that kind of degree of compassion and sense of empathy for what they were going through, and prepared to make sacrifices, to sacrifice, you know, their own lives. And she could do that with other people, not always agreeing with them. She loved the Berrigans. Dan Berrigan and Phil Berrigan were like sons to her, and she rejoiced in their willingness to go to jail for burning draft files, and she understood entirely what their intentions were. Even as she said, it's not really our way. It's not, I don't know. She had misgivings about the destruction of property, where that would lead. The War Sisters League had been vandalized probably by the cops or FBI or something. Other Catholic worker houses had faced that kind of thing. She was nervous about where that kind of action could go, but she had unreserved solidarity with those who were going to prison and who were laying their lives, on the line for the cause of peace and that kind of personal sacrifice. She also, you see her in the 60s here dealing with the enemies in our own household, in our own family, in struggling with what to do, with response as a faithful Catholic to, for instance, her own Archbishop, Cardinal Spellman, who was a, famous anti-communist, famous patriot, supporting the war in Vietnam completely, calling for total victory. And she writes, here, she's in his own archdiocese, it's gutsy, writes this letter called, this article, "In Peace is my bitterness most bitter," where she talks about how to love the enemies that are in your own family, your own household. And she recognizes, this is very brave of Cardinal Spellman to go to Vietnam and to pray with the troops. Well, why are all those troops over there? And what is this calling for total victory? Contradicting the Pope and that sort of thing. I mean, there's got analogs today in the American Church with, you've got Pope Francis, and then you've got these American bishops who are just not listening to him at all. So it was again a time of the struggle that she went through in her own kind of life, where of trying to deal with these contradictions and conflicts within the church itself. And how do you stay faithful and not just walk away from it? She often said, even in that article, yes, if Cardinal Spellman told me to shut down the Catholic worker, I would obey. And people said, well, what kind of anarchist does that make you? You're willing to do that. And she said, well, I can't really imagine he would actually do that. Maybe that was naive, but he didn't. And what concerned her more was that she felt that the example of a lot of bishops and people like that were actually driving young people away from the church, driving them away from the gospel and away from Jesus, because church leaders did not seem to be embodying the spirit of Jesus in the gospels. Her response to that was simply, again, this radical ecclesiology that she had. She never identified the church with the bishops. We are all part of the church, she would say. We're all sinners. And when she criticized the church, part of that was also self-reflection on her own failings, desire to be more faithful, to be more loving, to be braver. I'll skip ahead because I've taken up quite a lot of time here, but I'll just skip a little bit ahead and talk about the 1970s. We talked about the 60s. I'll make this much briefer. Dorothy is now in her 70s, and that kind of feverish, overheated spirit of the 60s has kind of cooled off. Now that didn't mean that peace and justice, were all blooming and had been achieved, but in a way, she felt that it was not such a bad thing. She felt, unlike a lot of radicals, she didn't look at the 60s with complete nostalgia. She felt there was a lot of nihilism, there was a lot of just sort of acting out in self-indulgent kinds of ways. This kind of enthusiasm of the youth, kind of culture could translate into kind of disdain for ordinary people and people who are older or weak or who are not so clever. So she felt that she was very traditional in her commitment to basic kind of Catholic moral principles about sexuality, marriage, and she felt that actually the 70s, from her point of view, was a time of going deeper, not just to protest, but that third kind of phase of focusing on alternatives and a different kind of society. So she was very excited about land trusts and different kinds of co-ops and different kinds of communities and appropriate technology and the idea of small is beautiful and decentralism, all those kinds of ideas, laying the groundwork of values that we need to have if we're going to have a sustainable, healthy, future. And she was, very excited about it. I think it's why she got very excited when I wrote these articles about Gandhian economics and stuff like that, and maybe editor of the Catholic Worker. That's sort of the thing that she thought we should be talking more about. But even though she's in her 70s, it's not like nothing was happening. She travels around the world. She goes to India and meets Mother Teresa there. She goes to Tanzania to look at the village socialism of Julius Nyerere. She goes to Russia, Soviet Russia, on this sort of pilgrimage because she had this deep, not only radical comrades of her youth who had fallen there, but also her love of Russian novelists and Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, but also Alexander Solzhenitsyn, her new favorite, who was not at all a favorite in the Soviet Union at that time. And also her attraction to Russian spirituality and icons and pilgrimage and the Jesus prayer and all those kinds of things. So she does that. She's still, supporting the anti-war movement during the Vietnam War. And then there's this thing with her, 1973, she's 75 years old. She gets arrested for the last time with the United Farm Workers in California. Now, Dorothy had been a huge supporter of Cesar Chavez and the farm workers going way back from the beginning of the 60s. She'd been out there many times. She had provided hospitality and funding for the farm workers. They had kind of base of operations at the Catholic Worker when they were in New York. She revered Cesar Chavez. He was, for her, in her mind, he was kind of great prophet of our time. Came from the poor, fighting for the most impoverished, workers, social justice, inspired by these kind of religious values, inspired by Gandhian nonviolence, a deep spirituality that pervaded the movement. So she felt it was not just working for better wage, working conditions and kind of labor issues, but that he really represented this. The whole movement had the spirit of this kind of building a new society, thing that she believed in so much. So it was very natural for her to go out to California. And while she was picketing there, she was arrested and spent 10 days on a work camp. Very famous picture by Bob Fitch, you've seen, where she's sitting on her little folding stool with these big burly police on either side. And it's just this kind of icon of kind of Buddha-like, contemplation and action and nonviolence. This little frail old woman, faced off with these burly cops with their clubs and pistols and everything. So that was her last time being arrested. She also takes on the IRS in her 70s when they come after her for supposedly not paying federal taxes, and she just utterly stands them down, refuses to cooperate, and they literally, this is under the Nixon administration, they backed down and let her off. But she was prepared to be homeless at that point. Here she is in her 70s, starting something completely new in the mid 70s, a house of hospitality for homeless women in New York City, Mary House, where she eventually died. And then there's her last talk. John asked me to make sure not to forget this. In 1976, she's invited to speak at the Eucharistic Congress in Philadelphia, along with Mother Teresa and Don Hope Camera and other people. And she's supposed to talk about women in the Eucharist. But her talk falls on August 6th, which is the anniversary of Hiroshima. And not only that, but the organizers of the Congress had scheduled for that very same day a mass for the armed services. And so she gets up with a lot of trepidation because she didn't like to speak in public very much. She actually wrote out her talk. It was published in the Catholic Worker. She was really trembling about it. And then also she felt such gratitude, for the church and the fact that they would invite her to speak about the Eucharist and everything like that. She didn't want to be the skunk, at the garden party. And for her to get up there and then say, she talks all about her gratitude to the church and what the church taught her about the Eucharist. and how all the physical aspects of the sacraments are among the things that really drew her to becoming a Catholic. But she says, I also learned from the church that before we offer our gifts, we must offer penance. We must do penance. And then she segues into, August 6th and what that means, and what it means then to schedule a mass for the armed services on that particular day. And she gives this little reflection about how our country has to do penance for what we did on August 6th. Now, whether it was coming on for a long time or the stress of that, but she had a heart attack afterwards. She never spoke in public again after that. And that represents the segue into the last few years of her life, where she's letting go, slowing down. This was the time, this is when I was editor of the Catholic Worker then. I started and I came to Worker in 75, 76, I became the editor. So I published her article there. So I remember that time very well, and what it was like and what it was like for Dorothy to kind of let go, to be, not disengaged, because she was very engaged, but, in a different way. And what you see in these last years in the columns, sometimes she'll just burst forward with this amazing article that's, like as great as anything she's ever written. And a lot of the time, it's just little snippets from her diaries about. She said she wanted to let people know she's still alive, and she continued that right up until she died. I'll just say, finally, what I experienced from her was this deep youthfulness, that I talked about, that her capacity to identify with young people. She didn't get old in that. She was very old. When I knew her in her late 70s, turned 80. She was, 83 when she died. But she had all kinds of physical problems, and she, by the end, could barely leave her room. But she was always interested in what was happening, and always encouraging young people to make mistakes and to follow their instincts. That she knew that we would do things wrong, we would mess up, but she wasn't, there to just constantly be correcting us and scolding us and telling us how we ought to do things. We had to learn for ourselves, and she had to trust them. She had to trust us, and she did trust us. And she identified also with our struggles and our doubts and our questions that we had, because she'd been through all that herself. There was a kind of just youthfulness to her all the time, right up to the end. And I guess the last thing I'll say is just, I didn't choose the title On Pilgrimage, for these books. That was the title of her column for many decades. And it was deeply meaningful, and it's reflected in these books. I think this idea that life as a kind of pilgrim, like Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, if we see our life not just as a lot of things that happen to us, but that it's we're headed toward this kind of goal. Everything is oriented toward, where we're going on this pilgrimage. That means that everything along the way is part of that story and is invested with kind of a deep spiritual content and meaning, as long as our life is this journey to be closer to Jesus, and ultimately that's what these two books are about. So we see this woman on pilgrimage through the 60s and through the 70s, decades that are so close to us that we're still living out so much of the memory and the drama and the impact of those years. And I think that it's, you read this and you're not just like amazed by her life, but it encourages you to think about your own life as a pilgrimage. Here we are, 40 years after her death. What is our pilgrimage? What are the issues of our day that we need to be responding to with a heart of Christ and a heart of peace and a heart of justice and a heart that listens to the poor, that listens to the earth, and where is that going to lead us? So I'll leave that there.
Thank you so much, Robert. Oh, thank you. That was just so beautiful. It's so good to just spend time reflecting on the lives of one of the great saints. And you walked through her whole life, especially those last 20 years in the writings. And it's very moving. And I love at the end how you talked about our own pilgrimage through life and what can we learn from her, and how is our lives a long pilgrimage to Jesus. I have a lot of questions for you, Robert, so buckle your seatbelt. And I'm hoping others do too, but I want to turn to Martha first. It's Martha Hennessy, who is Dorothy Day's granddaughter and a friend of Robert and mine. And I want to ask if Martha, you'd be willing, and she's going to do a Zoom for us in October, I think. And I'm going to, November, I'll look at the date later. I'll mention it. But I want to ask Martha, if you would like to respond or say anything, go ahead and unmute yourself. So friends, please welcome Martha Hennessy, Dorothy Day's granddaughter.
What can I say? You know,
Yeah.
Robert, I love you. You know, what a life and what a beautiful presentation you've given us. And, you know, to end it with that very question is so rich and so helpful. You know, how do we proceed, you know, to gain hearts of flesh in this world of hearts of stone? So that's all I have to say. Thank you so much. So beautiful.
So true, so beautiful. Okay, Robert, I'm going to ask you 3 words. And I'm glad you talked about pilgrimage, but I want to ask you to say a little bit more on the pilgrim theme, but writer, pilgrim, and woman. So for me, let me try to explain them as you're thinking about what you're going to say. You know, when I was getting involved 40 years ago, I saw in Dorothy Day and Merton and Daniel Berrigan and Gandhi writers. You know, I mean, she wrote nonstop, tons and tons and tons. And Gandhi published 2 massive newspapers. It's 100 volume of his writing. Merton's wrote 150 books, Dan on 50 books. And I thought that was part of the gospel way. And so you've edited her columns, but I wonder if you ever talk with her about that. What are your thoughts about her as a writer and writing as part of the living the gospel life? So that's the first word. Second, pilgrim, to say it a little bit more, which you didn't say, and her friends have told me, she was on the road 6 months a year for many, many decades. And it comes across in the books. And I've done that. I've been on the road for 6 months a year. It's intense. Yeah. But she was on a bus. You know, she'd be on a bus all day long and then go and visit a Catholic worker house and then give a talk. So she literally was on a pilgrim riding around the country. I wondered so she was a traveler and a witness. So her life was literally a pilgrimage. You can just say more about her travels. And I'm glad you mentioned those big trips. I mean, India is shocking. The other thing that is, I mean, it's just so amazing and such a gift is that she comes as a woman into this men's world, the Catholic Church, the peace movement, the labor movement, the Marxist movement, Marxist communism, those are men, politicians. I'm talking about in the 20s and the 30s up until the end. And now she's a superstar in the male Catholic Church. But who is she to just stand up as a woman and tell the male church and the world all this stuff? And what a gift. So any thoughts on those 3 words? Thanks.
I'll try to be succinct. On writing, you know, there's no question she was a born writer. She started writing when she was a little child. She said she would write little novels on pink paper that she would share with her sister. She was inspired by the books that she read. She was inspired by novels by Jack London and, you know, socially conscious kind of writers like that. The idea that writing could be a way that could shake people up, that could move people. She then, you know, discovered the Russian writers and Dostoevsky and the way that they could go so deeply into human psychology, the human spirit, you know, not just write about things that happen, but really, you know, this spirituality that could be communicated through writing. But I think that, you know, at the Catholic Worker, at least, you know, that Dorothy had this sense that writing was a way of fostering community. It was a way of treating people as she was writing for them as if they were her friends or family. and to report on what she'd seen, to share things that, but that answering letters was also part of that. Kind of. I sometimes when I edited her letters, I thought, you don't think of this, but probably her major apostolate was writing letters. She wrote for 10, 15 minutes in her diary every day. She seems to have spent hours every day writing letters, most of which are lost.
Mhm.
But that kind of engagement with other people was a lot of what her writing was about. As for the pilgrimage, yes, she was on the road constantly. Dorothy was a very extroverted person. She was a people person.
Oh,
She had to be with other people. She had to communicate. She had to get out on the road and both spread the word and learn about what other people were doing. And she went wherever she was invited, but she would go on these long, endless bus trips, all across the country. I mean, I cut that way down, but she'd go all through the Northwest and the plains and the Dakotas, and she'd go all through the South. She'd go through the Southwest, and she knew people all along. And it was this way of, it was kind of like St. Paul, with his voyages of kind of strength.
right.
Encouraging people on the ground, because they didn't have email and stuff back then. They had to hear her, they had to touch her, she had to speak to them, and she drew energy from that. I think she also needed to just get out of town occasionally because dealing with the craziness of a Catholic worker could be too much. The third thing about being a woman is I could talk a lot about that. But for Dorothy, was unconventional for her time, obviously, as a lay woman, an unmarried single mother, grandchildren, everything, who starts this lay Catholic movement without asking for permission or anything like that. I think she, in some ways that maybe helped her get away with some things because people were not so threatened by her as they might have been if it was a man doing this. But she really ran the movement, with kind of iron hand. But the thing that I think that about Dorothy that comes, she writes a lot about what women bring to peace or this kind of new work. She felt that men are more disposed to thinking abstractly about ideas and politics and ideology and that sort of thing. And she was always saying women are more in touch with just the dailiness of living. Whether it's cooking or caring for children or maintaining a household or that sort of thing, that men may not think as being very important, but she felt was like ultimately the kind of foundation of life. And of course, the Catholic worker is all about that. It's all about taking care of people and putting food on the table and cooking and gathering food and all of that sort of thing. So she was always talking about, she felt, and Peter Morin a little bit too, these people who are all ideas, but they don't actually get things done. And she had this, she was very, as Martha knows, very engaged with her own daughter and her family or all her grandchildren. She was a kind of a matriarch. She was kind of a mother to this extended family. And I experienced that very much. I felt, she would, kind of button up my jacket to make sure I was not going to get cold when I went out in the rain. And she would be concerned about whether people had something to eat and whether had a meal. And there was that kind of, and the other, like the first time I met, Dorothy, I've told this story before. I was 19 years old. I was trying to come up with something that would be impressive. And I said, how do you reconcile anarchism and Catholicism? And she just said, it's never been a problem for me. Well, what I learned about Dorothy was she didn't really write these abstract kind of articles. You talk about her writing. People say, how come you've never written like a treatise on nonviolence? You've never really written a treatise on anarchism or personalism or something like that. It was all rooted in daily life and in ordinary kind of relationships and how people lived out their ideas. So that's why she was fascinated by telling stories of Sacco and Vanzetti or Eugene Debs or labor martyrs or the saints or something like that. How did people live out their ideas? That was much more important to her than kind of abstract theological or ideological or political ideas. So we could talk all day about that, but I just wanted to give you a quick response to your.
Oh, that's great. I think we should talk all day about it. Thank you for answering that. I'm going to read to you my friend Cheryl's questions, unless Cheryl, if you're listening, you want to unmute yourself and go on the video and ask them yourself. Are you there, Cheryl?
I
Yeah.
just came back.
Okay. So Robert, this is my friend Cheryl from Massachusetts. Go ahead, Cheryl.
Hi. So two things, kind of very different level. What I'm getting from this amazing life story, with all her flexibility, is that in the end, though, no matter how much peacemaking we do, we have to have a spiritual underpinning. For her, clearly, it was the church. And I'm not a Catholic, so for me, it would be a little different, but that sounds like her prerequisite, even though she wasn't judgmental of people maybe who didn't necessarily have that. And the other question is just, how did she pay for her travels? She was a woman committed to what seemed like voluntary poverty, and yet she was always on the road. Thank you.
Well, on the last question, her travels, she traveled very poorly by Greyhound bus, packing peanut butter sandwiches to eat along the way and enjoying the hospitality. She wasn't staying in a Holiday Inn on the way. She was sleeping on a couch or a guest room wherever she went. And in fact, her travels, generated some money for the Catholic workers. One of the reasons she did that too. She'd get paid a little bit for giving a talk here or there or something like that. No, as for the international travels, those were all gifts from patrons who paid for her to go to Rome or to go to Russia on a tour around. She was invited to go to Australia, and that allowed her to have a round the world ticket. So she came back by way of India and Africa, England, all part of the same ticket that had been paid for by her host. So she'd write about that. If you want to read more about it in the book, people would ask, can you afford all this? And she writes about it in her columns, where the money comes from, that sort of thing. As for, yes, I think the peacemaking, for her, it didn't have to necessarily be. It was not just for Catholics, obviously, but she felt that we had to live peace, before we could make peace. We had to be in peace and pursue that, in our own hearts. Now, you could do it otherwise. Lots of people don't do that, and they work for peace. But she felt that ultimately, we had to kind of embody the values or the goals that we're trying to set about in the world. And if you are, you can pursue peace in a way that just makes enemies out of your adversaries, that makes it impossible to change hearts, that makes it impossible to foster a dialogue, that just polarizes people, that just proves how righteous you are, and how much superior you are to everybody else. And that's the point you're really trying to get across. There could be ego involved in that. There could be competition, there could be self-righteousness, there could be all kinds of things. Now, Thomas Merton writes extensively about this, of course, in many his writings on the kind of spirituality of peacemaking. And it was also, it's there in Gandhi as well. It's there, Martin Luther King, certainly. Now, the main thing about peacemaking is that it's never finished. And it is not like, well, that wasn't so hard. Here's peace now. It's always going to be, it's an ongoing, it's a way of life for her, and many came and went and burned out or whatever, and she kept at it for 50 years or so. So yeah.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Cheryl. I remember, Cheryl, some of the Catholic workers told me she had no money, Cheryl. Mm-hmm. Like if she had $10 at the end of the day, she would give it to the homeless person. Like there was literally, she personally had no physical dollars. Mm-hmm. I was made an impression on me in 1982 when I first stayed at the New York Catholic Worker. I remember my friend, who's a good friend of Dan's, Father Ray, told us the story when he was a young priest. He invited her to speak at his parish in Providence, Rhode Island. And he went and picked her up at the bus. And she had a little bag. And she told him that she just traveled with, a little piece of underwear, her Bible, the rosary, and a can of instant coffee.
Mhm.
because you could always get hot water, and she drank coffee morning, noon, and night. That made an impression on me. And she had her journals with her, and she told him that she had lived like that for 40 or 50 years with the instant coffee and the writing and the Bible. And I thought, this is somebody I like. Anyway, great. It's a very important question about faith as the basis of peacemaking. And ultimately, she wasn't a theoretist, but the God of peace was at the basis of her life, Cheryl, and Jesus. And just, I think that's where we're going with this. Now, there's a question here from an Amanda. I don't know you, Amanda. Welcome, Robert. It's about Dorothy's connection with Benedictine spirituality, if you could reflect on that. She writes, why did Dorothy choose to become an oblate of St. Procopius Abbey in Illinois? What was Dorothy's specific connection to Benedictine spirituality? Does she write about this at all?
Dorothy didn't write about that, very much. Interested. She'd make reference. She'd say, "By the way, I am a Benedictine oblate." Now, I didn't really understand this very much myself until recently. And Brian Terrell, a Catholic worker comrade of mine, who's also a Benedictine oblate, said that this is not some canonical office or something like a third order Franciscan or something like that. Anybody can be a Benedictine oblate, Protestant. You don't have to be Catholic. Basic kind of an affiliation with a particular Benedictine community and a kind of commitment to try to implement, the spirit of Saint Benedict in your life. And Dorothy was attracted to various religious movements, particularly the spirituality of Charles de Foucault, who's just recently been canonized. That kind of dialogue of life and of imitating the hidden life of Jesus, living among the poor. But she was attracted to this particular Benedictine abbey because they had a specific kind of vocation of reconciliation with Eastern Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, and that was something that appealed to her very much because of her deep attraction to Orthodoxy and to the role of icons in Russian spirituality. So that was one of the issues. Now, as for generally, of course, Benedictine spirituality permeates, kind of Catholic worker on a lot of levels, just as Franciscan spirituality, does. She kind of borrowed from so many different saints and different traditions. In terms of, the Benedictine idea is that the way, the monastery is a school of holiness. Not because there's all this emphasis on asceticism and seeing how long you can fast and all that kind of stuff. It's a school of love where your way of becoming holy is in community with all the people who are there with you, who are not perfect people, not people you necessarily would want to live with or have as your roommates, but is this determination to stay in a place like that. And to, under the leadership of an abbot who's kind of working to get everybody to coordinate like an orchestra, to work out your holiness through humility and obedience and a way of life that balances work and prayer. And that sort of that also with Dorothy's emphasis on what she called a philosophy of work in her own, kind of sacramental liturgical life, and going to mass every day and reading the Bible. And then there's a third aspect of that. Well, also then the Benedictine kind of idea of hospitality is right there in the rule of Saint Benedict. Very important, hospitality. And then finally, the spirit of peace. Pax is the motto of the Benedictine order, peace. And this idea of the Benedictine monastery as a kind of oasis of peace, in the midst of this, crumbling social order. So I think those were all principles that were important to her.
That's brilliant, Robert. I mean, as you speak, I realize she had no Jesuit spirituality. I don't think there was much Franciscan spirituality either, but I see Benedictine everywhere now in her life. And you didn't mention that she prayed the Psalms. In effect, she read the Psalter every morning.
Well, so she would, she read the breviary. That's really something that like monks and priests would do. the idea of a
Yeah.
layperson, saying the office, every day. And at the Catholic Worker, we would say, Vespers in the evening. Everybody would sit and read the
Did you
Psalms
do
together.
that with her?
Oh yeah, everybody
Did
did.
you?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah, we
that's a
did.
very monastic way.
So that was
Hospitality, but the Psalms, and that's not Franciscans actually or Jesuit. But anyway, that's really good.
I could
As
talk,
far as I
I could
can
talk
tell,
about the Franciscan and those Jesuit influences. They're also there.
as far as I can tell, there's two full-time Catholic worker friends on here, and I want to ask if they want to speak. Julia from the Las Vegas, if you want to unmute and share anything.
Well,
And
that's pretty-
Dennis, if you're
I'll
there
share.
with them from, just hold on, from Guadalupe, California. Dennis, if you want to come on, you want to ask Robert anything. And I also in this group, Rosalie, if you're there, Rosalie, the Catholic worker historian, if you want to unmute and show yourself, you're welcome to join in and ask Robert anything. Go ahead, Julia, first.
I was just going to say, my questions were going to be exactly that question about how connected she was as a Benedictine oblate, because particularly right now, and I just read the rule. I've read like 3 books. I'm just kind of 3 books of commentary on the rule and how to integrate it into one's life. And I too see this whole resonance all over the experience of Catholic worker life and the Benedictine values, principles. So my question was similar in the sense of, okay, I feel to try to like integrate more intentionally and consciously this whole some of these ideas that are already in there with the Catholic worker. So it's that was my reflection.
It's worth pointing out, that there are big differences between the Catholic worker and a Benedictine monastery, in the sense that that it was sort of open to everybody, the kind of halt and the lame and the mentally disordered, and so it did not have the kind of tidiness of a Benedictine monastery, but it was it was one of those inspirations.
Thanks.
Dennis, thank you, Julia. Nice to see you. Dennis, jump in if you want.
Yeah, I don't have a question really. I might be, of all Catholic workers, I might be the least knowledgeable about the life of Dorothy Day. I came to Catholic worker kind of late in life. And so this presentation was really, really helpful for me. I'm grateful for it. I kind of got my understanding of Catholic worker life from the Los Angeles Catholic Worker, which was my first introduction to Catholic worker life. And, as all of you who are Catholic workers know, there's no such thing as a typical Catholic worker.
Right.
And LA is certainly a different Catholic worker than ours in Guadalupe. But I think there is a commonality among the Catholic workers. That's just a general kind of value structure that matches Dorothy's. There's this idea that the works of mercy aren't enough. You have to ask the question, why are people in this situation to start with, and then try and do something about that, or at least address it. And so even though I think of it as an anarchist movement, there is this kind of foundational structure that almost magically follows Dorothy's structure, which is hospitality, service to the community around you, and resistance to the structures that cause those issues. So there's not a question in there. I'm just going on and on. Maybe 10 seconds.
I agree. That's what I was I gave a talk, it was printed in the Catholic Worker a year or 2 ago, where about I talked about the ingredients of the Catholic worker soup, kind of it's the recipe, and or you could call it the charism of the Catholic worker. So that even though it has different people, and people come from completely different places, some of them feel more or less attached to the Catholic Church or not, but that, that idea of the works of mercy, rooted in this idea that we encounter Christ in our neighbor, and then the question of not just addressing their needs, but also the combining charity with justice, so that not just giving food to the hungry, but challenging, if not solving the problem, at least challenging a kind of system that creates so many people who are hungry. And then that third aspect of it, which, as I said, is that kind of pointing toward an alternative or a different horizon of meaning or value, and trying to live that out. You take those kind of three things, and a lot of people, everybody knows about the works of mercy and the soup kitchen, Not everybody, gets the other part of it, but you could just have those two things. What really makes it that Catholic worker thing is that not just protesting, but also announcing some kind of alternative world or society or culture, and trying to embody that and live that out. Sorry.
Yeah. I think another observation is that in terms of the differences between perhaps Benedictine spirituality and Catholic worker is that the asceticism and or simplicity and or living among or with the poor wasn't just an act of sacrifice, but really as a means of being identifying with and therefore being changed by the experience of living with the poor. And so it's almost as though there was this sense of one's own life being altered by it. And so she mirrored it, but with a sense of hope and with a sense of vision that is what is so profound and why it extended so far even to now, so I don't know, I was just well,
I totally agree, and that there I would say is the sort of Franciscan idea too, that voluntary poverty is not just not having stuff. It's for St. Francis, it's putting your treasure somewhere else. It's where your heart is, that's where your treasure is. Kind of a different center of what's valuable and what's meaningful. And if you do that, a lot of that other stuff just falls away by itself, and you find it makes you more transparent and available to the people around you, and in a greater sense of community and solidarity. You don't have to have the violence of a lock on your door and make sure that you're protected from the people who want to take things away from you. It's a spirit of systematic giving rather than a systematic taking. And so it's not measured just in the level of your acquisitions or your property, but a whole kind of spirituality and way of being.
Yes.
That I know, and I say things like that, and I think like, well, like, am I living that? Is that the way I live? Compared to you and Catholic Worker House, and I don't want to come across as a big phony here that I'm Dorothy Day or something. This is what I've learned from her, and what I try to be challenged by, and try to take, let it take root in my heart.
Thank you. It's beautiful and helpful. I want to give a last word if she's there, Rosalie. If you want to unmute yourself, and if you want to add anything, she's one of the historians of the Catholic Worker, Rosalie Reigel. If you're on, if you hear me, and maybe that you don't want to, that's totally fine. Okay, so I see she's not responding. So, well, maybe our time is up then, Robert.
Can I just say one thing? I just want to say that this is Julia from the Las Vegas Catholic Worker. I was 18 and actually, Robert, I remember meeting you that summer.
Yes.
In Los Angeles.
I recognize you.
But I want to say that your talk today, it just amazes me how I was brought into the Catholic Worker and inspired by seeing these adults embrace these values that, of course, Dorothy embodied. And then just today, still like, almost 50 years later, as I hear you talking about him, I'm just still like so excited about it and so inspired by it. It's just still has a wonderful, powerful, hopeful thing to offer us now. So that's it.
No, John, I noticed that
That's
there were
so
a
helpful.
lot of questions were posted on the chat thing, and I was, listening, and so I was not answering people's questions. I don't know if there's a way to answer those later or not, but I apologize for people if I'm not able to.
No, you did great. And there's been comments and stuff and people, but we've had a great hour and a half. I really thank you. How about on behalf of everybody, we show our gratitude to Robert. Really, Robert, it was so powerful and moving. As Julia just said, you laid out our whole life and of course the 2 books, but the world is full of so much bad news. And here's this rock of Gibraltar, Dorothy Day, and who is just so far ahead of us in following Jesus here and now, and some of us our own lifetimes, I guess all of us. And you knew her and you've helped us so much. It's such a gift. And it's such a precious way to reflect, on our own lives and how, okay, as you said, so what's our next step on our pilgrimage and following Jesus, living the works of mercy and the works of peace and nonviolence? So I really, really thank you. I thank you for that question and begging everybody's patience. If I could make a little 2-second commercial announcement here. We have a whole list of Zooms coming up for the rest of the year, and I really invite you all to sign up, but you could really help me by spreading the word about the Beatitudes Center. Tell a friend or 2 or 10 or 20 about them, put it in your newsletters. August 6th, 2 weeks from today, Hiroshima Day, my friend Roshi Joan Halifax is going to talk about the Buddhist path of peace and nonviolence. That's great. She's one of the greatest teachers of Buddhism in the world. The following week, I'm going to do a session on the theology of peace and nonviolence based on my book, The God of Peace. That's August 13th. Saturday, September 10th, Reverend Jim Lawson's going to come back. My friend, Dr. King's great friend, on his new book, Revolutionary Nonviolence, and continue to teach us about nonviolence. September 24th, my friend Carolyn Whitney Brown, who was Henry Nouwen's friend, has a big new book based on Henry's writings about Henry's spirituality of the circus. So it's going to be a session about Henry Nouwen. And Carolyn lived with Henry at L'Arche for many years. Saturday, October 1st, Professor David O'Brien is going to talk about Catholic social teaching. He's probably the leading Catholic historian in the country. October 15th, a young, great scholar on nonviolence, Kazu Haga, a friend of mine from Oakland, who had published a really terrific book called Healing Resistance, is going to walk us through Dr. King's principles of nonviolence. And then November 12th, Martha Hennessy is here today, is going to give her talk on Dorothy Day and gospel nonviolence. And you're all welcome, especially for all of these, but that one, to return to hear Martha reflect on her grandmother. On Saturday, December 3rd, probably the world's leading expert on nonviolent resistance, along with Erica Chenoweth, Maria Stefan will be here with us. She's just an amazing scholar. So please join us. Tell people about the Beatitude Center, make a contribution if you can, pray for this little project. You see what I'm trying to do is spread the teachings of Jesus's way of peace and nonviolence and the gospel far and wide through this technology. So I thank you all for your listening and being here. Thank you. Sorry if we didn't get to your question or comment. Thank you, Robert, for all the great work you've done in ministry, and to everybody. And I send you forth with a mighty blessing to go forth as peacemakers and to be pilgrims of peace and teachers of peace, and like Dorothy and Robert, prophets of peace to our poor world. So God bless you all. Have a great day. See you next time.
Thank you.
And thank you for being here. Okay. Bye-bye. Signing off now.